Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to look at one of the most famous poems of the 20th century in a totally new light. And in doing so, we might just uncover the story of a global catastrophe that history basically forgot. All right, let's get right into it. We're talking about T.S. Eliot's masterpiece, The Wasteland, a poem you've probably heard of, maybe even studied. But what if I told you that its deepest fears, the ones right there in that handful of dust, aren't about what we've always been taught? Okay, so for about a century now, the story has been pretty much set in stone. The Wasteland, oh, that's the great poem of the post-World War I lost generation. End of story. And for a long time, this made perfect sense, right? I mean, you look at the evidence. The poem's all chopped up and fragmented, it's full of images of corpses and decay, and there's this heavy, heavy sense of despair. Everything seemed to point straight back to the trauma of the Great War. But, and this is a big but, here's the twist. There was another catastrophe happening, one that was actually even deadlier than the war, and it was raging across the entire planet at the exact moment Eliot was putting pen to paper. The 1918 Spanish flu. So this brings up a really fascinating question, something really human about how we remember things. Why is it that we build monuments to wars, but we let pandemics just fade away? How does something so huge become a kind of cultural ghost? Well, it seems to come down to the way we process trauma. You see, a war, as horrific as it is, becomes a collective story. We talk about sacrifice, heroism, a shared struggle. You can build a monument to that. But a pandemic? That's a totally different beast. It's personal, it's lonely, it's this quiet, internal battle against an enemy you can't even see. And that feeling of helplessness, it's just so much harder to turn that into a public memory. So, if we want to find the pandemic inside the poem, where do we start? We have to start with the poet himself. And believe it or not, the key to the whole thing might just be hiding in his personal letters. And what these letters show is, well, it's pretty undeniable. For years, from 1918 right up to 1921, influenza wasn't just some news story in the background. No, it was this constant, inescapable part of life for both Eliot and his wife, Vivian. And get this whole period ends with Eliot having a complete nervous breakdown right when he's writing The Wasteland. It got so deep into his head that he even started using the language of sickness to talk about his own life. He actually described his strained marriage as a long epidemic of domestic influenza. I mean, that tells you everything, doesn't it? That whole atmosphere of contagion had just seeped into his very way of thinking. Okay, so now that we have this context, this personal story of sickness, let's go back to the poem. Suddenly, all those famously difficult parts, the things that have baffled critics for a century, they start to look different. Less like some abstract post-war angst, and a lot more like a shockingly vivid description of what it feels like to be seriously physically ill. So if we're going to make this case, we can break the evidence down into three main things we can find right there in the poem itself. First, the logic of a fever dream. Second, the actual physical sensations of a sick body. And third, this pervasive atmosphere of contagion. So first up, delirium. You know, that disturbed state of mind you can get from a really high fever, where you're restless, confused, maybe even hallucinating? Well, that was a super common symptom of the Spanish flu. Now just listen to these lines. Bats with baby faces, crawled head downward down a blackened wall. I mean, come on. That is a perfect description of the bizarre topsy-turvy world of a fever dream. All those jarring jumps and strange images in the poem, they suddenly make a different kind of sense. Maybe it's not just modernist fragmentation. Maybe it's literally the logic of delirium. And it's not just the delirium. The poem is absolutely soaked in the physical feelings of being sick with the flu. You have the relentless burning, burning, burning of a fever, that desperate thirst, drip, drop, but there is no water, the fear of what's in the air, the wind under the door, and that quiet, awful feeling of being trapped in a sick room. All right, so let's move on from the sickness itself to the aftermath. Because the poem doesn't just talk about being ill, it documents the absolutely overwhelming scale of death that the flu left in its wake. And here's a really crucial point. All the dead bodies in the wasteland, they aren't soldiers on some distant battlefield. No, they're civilians. They're in the city, in the back alleys, in people's homes. This is a perfect reflection of a pandemic, which brings death into the civilian world, not just the military one. And this quote from historian John Barry just nails it. the most terrifying thing was the piling up of bodies. Think about that. In cities all over the world, just like Eliot's London, there were just too many dead to deal with. The poem is giving a voice to that exact terrifying reality. But maybe the most powerful link of all is this. The poem is obsessed with silence, with people failing to communicate, with things being forgotten. And isn't that a perfect description of the cultural amnesia that swallowed the pandemic whole? It's like the poem isn't just about the flu. It's about the forgetting of the flu. And all of a sudden, this new reading of a 100-year-old poem becomes, well, it becomes incredibly, almost uncomfortably relevant, especially when we hold it up like a mirror to what we've all just lived through. You just have to look at the powerful, heartbreaking images from photojournalists like Danish Siddiqui during the COVID-19 pandemic. Those scenes of mass cremations, they're a terrifyingly modern echo of that piling up of bodies from 1918, the very civilian tragedy Eliot seems to have been writing about. So, what's the big takeaway here? Because this isn't just some clever new academic theory for an old poem. It's really about something much, much bigger. When you read The Wasteland this way, you're not just reading a poem. You're reclaiming a massive, forgotten piece of our history. It shows you how art can sometimes hold on to the memories that culture tries to push aside. It even gives us a new language, a new way to think about our own pandemic experience. And it reminds us just how hard it is to tell the story of a tragedy like this. And all of this leaves us with one last, pretty urgent question. A century from now, when people look back at the art and the stories from our time, what will they see? What will our pandemic's wasteland reveal about us? What did we choose to remember? And what did we allow to be forgotten?